We live in a world now that wants us to believe that every time you have a feeling, there's something wrong with you. And we're supposed to feel things. We have pathologized just sort of the experience of being human.
This episode is sponsored by TherapyNotes, therapynotes.com. Be sure and check them out, and be sure and use the promo code Gordon, Gordon, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. Over 15 years ago, when I started my private practice, I had to learn a lot, and most of it the hard way, and I don't think you need to do the same. Hi, I'm Gordon Brewer, a licensed psychotherapist, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast, part of the Psychcraft network of podcasts. Join me in this journey of discovery as we have conversations with other leaders and professionals in both the mental and allied health fields. Join us as we explore both the business and clinical sides of running a private practice. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. This is episode number 386 of the Practice of Therapy podcast, and I'm Gordon Brewer. So glad you've joined me for this particular episode. I'm really looking forward to you hearing from an old friend, Kerry Thomas. Interesting kind of little backstory, which I'll tell a little bit more in this particular episode. But Kerry and I grew up just literally around the block from each other and didn't realize it. And we connected recently and just kind of were able to reminisce about growing up in Cary, North Carolina, which is where we're both from. But Kerry now lives in Western North Carolina and actually close to me here in Tennessee. And we got to spend an afternoon together here recently and just reconnected and just talking about her work and all that she's doing. But looking forward to you hearing my conversation with Kerry and just how we've come to think about mental health, particularly from a medical model, and just some of the ideas that Kerry has come up with and just her own life experience, and also working as a therapist and just understanding the importance of nutrition and the impact that medicines can have on us and that sort of thing. But it's a fascinating conversation and a lot of great information there that Kerry offers from her research and the work that she's doing currently just in her practice. So stay tuned for that. But before we get to my conversation with Kerry, I'd love for you to find out more about how you might integrate yoga in your practice. My good friend, Chris McDonald, also who is in North Carolina, has put together some courses on integrating yoga in your practice. And so if you'll go over to practiceoftherapy.com/yoga, you can find out more about that. And also, if you're subscribed to my email list, you will have gotten some information this past week on that. But anyway, be sure and check it out, practiceoftherapy.com/yoga, and learn about some of the courses that Chris is putting together around how to integrate yoga into your therapy practice. And also, before we get to my conversation with Kerry, I'd love for you to hear more from our sponsor of the podcast, TherapyNotes, along with some words from one of our members of the Psychcraft network.
Hi, I'm Whitney Owens. If you don't know me, I am the person behind the Wise Practice podcast, which is part of the Psychcraft network of podcasts. I am so proud to be a part of this network, along with my good friend Gordon Brewer, who's doing such amazing work on helping people on their practice journey. If you haven't discovered the Wise Practice podcast yet, you can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. I'd love for you to join us as we explore how to grow a faith-based practice that brings you the income you need and the lifestyle you want. Be sure to check out the podcast and other helpful information at whitneyowens.com.
Rachel here with a quick shout out to TherapyNotes, the EHR that Gordon uses and loves for running his group practice. If you've ever been looking for a solid, all-in-one platform to manage your notes, scheduling, billing, and even secure client messaging, this is it. Gordon's been using TherapyNotes for years, and it's honestly made a huge difference in how smooth things run behind the scenes. He's always saying how it saves him time and keeps everything organized, and as a practice owner, that's huge. And get this, they've just rolled out Therapy Fuel, which is an amazing suite of AI tools that help write your notes faster. You can generate progress notes from session summaries or even from transcriptions. You can also create contact notes straight from secure messages and automatically summarize client history forms. Basically, it's like having a little documentation assistant built right in. Plus, TherapyNotes is always adding new features like automated payments, secondary insurance billing, and a growing library of outcome measures. And if you ever get stuck, their customer service is phenomenal. Seriously, you can call or email 24/7 and talk to someone who actually knows what they're doing. So, if you've ever been thinking about switching or just getting started, now's a great time. Head over to therapynotes.com, click Start My Free Trial, and use the promo code GORDON to get 2 months free. All right, back to the show.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the podcast. And I'm really thrilled for you to get to know today Kerry Thomas. And Kerry, turns out that she is an old but new friend. And so I'll tell a little bit of the backstory between how Kerry and I connected here in a little bit. But Kerry, as I start with everyone, tell folks a little bit about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed.
Okay, so I have been in the field of mental health for about 25 years now. I originally came into this field inspired to help children who were, whose parents were maybe divorcing, because that's sort of what led me there, watching my own children struggle through the divorce that I had with their dad. And I got into the field very excited to help children, and for the first 5 years, worked in community mental health. And then after that, I went into private practice. And I kind of pivoted really more towards working with folks who had eating disorders, because I was finding a lot of children having them, and a lot of recognizing that there were a lot of people that were seeking treatment, that were going to people that didn't have experience with that themselves. And I had when I was in the 5th grade. And so I was hearing stories of maybe what people's experiences were in therapy. And I thought, this is a field that I think would be really helpful for people who actually had that as a lived experience. And so I started really focusing on working with folks who had eating disorders, and most of them were, restrictive eaters, what we characteristically call anorexia nervosa. And I began to notice trends in the people I was working with. And what I noticed was that the longer they went without food, the more their cognitive function and their mood was being really affected. And it caused me to reflect on my own experience in the 5th grade. And how that looked was, I was sort of this chubby little 5th grader, as most 5th graders are. The beauty standard at that time was Twiggy, with the very pronounced cheekbones and being a very impressionable 5th grader with this very round face and this little plump body. I thought, well, I'll just go on a diet, right? I didn't know what I was doing, but I started restricting food intake. Now, what happens within the human brain when we begin to restrict food intake is our brain responds with a dopamine, with a flood of dopamine, which is meant to energize us, right? Because back when, thousands of years ago, when people were roaming the Serengeti or whatever, and they weren't eating, it was probably because, they didn't have access to food. So the body energizes itself in order to help the person get up, get food. But it creates an addictive response, is really what happened to me too. But what I was really thinking about noticing was that, when I started that process originally, I was not depressed. But by the end of that year and a half, I was knee walking depressed. And so I started thinking, could there be a relationship between nutrition, cognitive function, and mood? And so I started doing some research, and what I learned sort of blew my mind, quite honestly. And of course, there's a relationship. I mean, our brain is our most metabolically demanding organ, so it consumes the vast majority of nutrients and minerals that we give it over and above every other organ in our body. And so when we are not getting what it needs, it depletes mood. It affects our ability to think clearly, to be present, to use that prefrontal cortex to make the best use of it that we can. And so I just continued to do a lot more research and then started learning a lot more about psychiatric medications that I never knew before, that I found very troublesome. And the more I read and the more I researched, the more troubled I became. And now, it's almost hard to find people who aren't taking them. I have a dear friend, and this was many years ago, who worked for a very large company in the Research Triangle Park, and she was working in the inside sales department with like 30 other women because it was a group that was, predominantly female. And she had told me that every single woman she knew in that department was taking something. My children's father, who had a Kids Are Kids franchise, was telling me recently, just a few months ago, that it was not at all uncommon for parents who were bringing their children in who were 2 years old and putting them on psychiatric medication. And so I'm kind of at a point where I feel like it's imperative. I mean, nobody's getting informed consent about the psychiatric medications and what the long-term effects of these meds are. And I just think that's wrong. I think that people, when they are, desperate for help, struggling, suffering, to take something that they think is going to help improve them, they deserve to know. And it just breaks my heart in particular to know that so many children whose brains are still developing are, taking lots of different medications that are having profound impacts on brain development and thus, going to affect them for the rest of their lives. And we don't know what that looks like. We don't know what it's going to be like for a child who's, for example, been taking medication since they were 2, right? And as their brain is developing through their lifespan, what is that outcome going to look like at the end? I think about, for example, amphetamines, just for one, which really suppress your growth hormones. And that's not just going to affect the height of the child, right? It's going to affect the growth of every organ in their body and their heart, their lungs, right? And so I really feel like we are taking a lot of chances, that we are believing things that are coming from chemical companies that are profiting to the tune of, billions of dollars a year. I think it was like in 2015, we spent $40 billion in this country on psychiatric medication, and that was 10 years ago. And it's hard to find current data. I think the only thing I could find was like in 2019, we spent $31.7 billion on psychiatric medication in the United States just for adults, people over 18. And the fastest growing, and this goes back about 7 years, the fastest growing segment of the population taking psychiatric medication were people under the age of 5.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I became very disturbed and bothered by what I was learning about the medications themselves and what they're doing to the human brain and the human body. But then I also learned a great deal about, how we really can modify and improve mood, how we really can affect brain function, focus, that work in harmony with the body. I mean, the body operates on, vitamins and minerals and proteins, amino acids, and so I don't think it's ever been true, and it has been proven to not be true, that serotonin affects depression. They've done multiple studies to try to prove this, and actually what they've done is proven the opposite. So we don't, if we're depressed, we're not experiencing a serotonin deficiency. The same way, if you have social anxiety and then you drink beer and it makes you a little bit, more relaxed and you can talk at a party, we're not going to say your social anxiety is due to an alcohol deficiency, right? And so I guess I just feel so compelled to certainly let the people in our role know this. I've compiled a lot of data. I was presenting on this prior to 2020. The last presentation I did was for the LPC Association conference in November of 2019. And ever since then, I've been busy doing so many other things. I moved to the mountains. I've been growing food. I've been rehabbing this 71-year-old house. But I think it's time now to kind of get back into this mode of helping people understand that there are much better ways that don't have negative side effects, really have absolutely positive side effects.
Right.
And empower people so that they're not dependent on a system, right?
Yeah. Well, I know, Kerry, when you and I got the privilege of being able to just kind of spend an afternoon together, just talking about all of these things. But a little bit of I want to share with people a little bit of the backstory, because Kerry lives over the mountain from me. I'm in East Tennessee and she's over in North Carolina. And when we connected, Kerry had reached out to me, just curious about podcasting and that sort of thing. And lo and behold, we realized that we grew up literally a block apart from each other. I'm a little older than Kerry, but we lived in the same neighborhood, had some of the same friends, and all of that. And just who would have known that we were that in that close of a proximity? I saw that she was from Cary, North Carolina, which is where I grew up. And so we connected on so many levels around all of that. But, I think one of the things that just impressed me the most is just how much passion Kerry has for this whole area of taking a much more holistic approach to what we do, and really just thinking about, the fix, if you will, is probably not, and we know this just kind of intrinsically, not about just giving somebody a pill and then expecting things to magically change and their life getting better and that sort of thing. It really has to do more on the psychological level, of course, of being more self-aware, more mindful, more grounded, all of those things that we know are important, but also doing the same with what we put into our bodies around nutrition and just our food and all of that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
And so, Kerry, and so what are you finding, Kerry, as some pretty significant alternatives to the traditional, let's get somebody on an SSRI and then put them in therapy kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, so what you're describing is like this medical disease model, right? You have a feeling, oh my gosh, there must be something fundamentally wrong with your brain. So that's my first issue, because we live in a world now that wants us to believe that every time you have a feeling, there's something wrong with you. And we're supposed to feel things. We have pathologized just sort of the experience of being human. And the other thing that I think is so important for us to all recognize is that this world has changed so much from like when you and I were kids. And when you've got these little handheld computers, right? You think, I think it's really important to sort of sit with how sort of fundamentally detached we are from like our connection to one another and to nature, right? And we've been kind of programmed to be, working really hard, and we're being terrified on the daily. When we were growing up, and the only information that was coming at us was through 3 television stations, it was more manageable, right? And so we have these little devices that we pull up and we look at, and we're being terrified and just even overwhelmed, right? We can see within like a 10-second scroll, our brain is being pulled in all these different directions, which is just incredibly overwhelming. to the human animal. I mean, if you go back thousands and thousands of years, we were living in tribes, right? And so we were so much more connected. We were so much more connected to nature. We had a much stronger social connection. And we were watching the grass blow on the prairie, like we weren't being just completely overwhelmed. And so, like, I think it's important to sort of keep our expectations realistic, right? And to also understand these things that are going on and really modifying our exposure to a lot of that. Understanding, so for example, like the exposure to the EMFs and maybe not sleeping with the Wi-Fi router in a bedroom, right? Like being very thoughtful of all the different things. So I think really maybe the first thing we should really look at is sort of like looking across the whole landscape, right? Like, am I spending time in nature? And how much time am I spending on this device? Am I eating a diet predominantly of like processed food, which is not food, right? And it's full of so many toxicants. I found this really interesting statistic today about the difference between the food additives that are allowed in the United States and those allowed in Europe. And you will find this fascinating. So in Europe, they allow 363 food additives like in their food production. Here in the United States, it's over 10,000. And so we have to think about how these things affect us because like going back to the brain being so nutritionally hungry, right? Like it requires so much nutrition to function well. And, and one of the biggest, I think one of the biggest challenges for me when I think about people going into a doctor's office and saying, look, I'm depressed, right? Because depression correlates almost perfectly with inflammation. So if I am inflamed, I have a rise in what is called a cytokine, which is just a protein. But cytokines and depression, one-on-one correlation, right? So that might be the body's first signal that there is something physiologically going on in your body, right? So in the United States, we act as if, if you have some sort of issue as far as like how you're feeling, maybe anxiety or depression, it's just something that exists in your head. It's almost like this thing is detached from the rest of this body, right? And this is just one machine, right? It's one system and it's all completely interrelated. So if I'm having, issues with mood or cognitive function or focus, I really want to think about, am I fueling this well? Number one, am I putting things into it that are going to cause, or am I doing things or not doing things that are going to increase, like, for example, my toxic load and then causing inflammation that is going to immediately set off depression or anxiety, right? So we want to be really thoughtful with how much exposure we're getting to things, how connected we are to people and nature. How are we eating? Are we eating closer to the way our ancestors ate, like real food, right? Like, is it coming in a package with a lot of ingredients on a label, right? Because that's really not food. It's a food-like product, right? But it's not going to give my body what it needs, and it's going to give my body a lot of what it doesn't need. So it's the funny thing is, when it comes to impacting mood and cognitive function in a more healthy, reasonable, maybe human way, it's really not that hard. It's really not that difficult. It's not that complicated, and I think, but the first step is awareness. The first step is understanding that we hold some power here, that we don't need to be chemically dependent, right, on products that have, there was a study that came out of the Women's Health Initiative just recently within the last few years that showed that women taking antidepressants within a year, they increase all-cause mortality by 32%. We need to sit with that. We need to sit with how toxic is a product that when I take it for just a year, I have increased my odds of dying by 32%. And really think about, is that really a solution? When I can learn about how this thing functions and how to fuel it, and I
Mm-hmm.
can live my life more intentionally, make sure I'm getting some sunshine, make sure I'm getting some time out in nature, make sure I'm eating real food, make sure I'm getting a lot of clean filtered water, right?
Mm-hmm.
And feel so much better and not, not make my situation worse.
Right, right. And if you think about it in just in our field, in the mental health fields, we know firsthand the whole somatic effect of what happens in our bodies when we are feeling stress or we're feeling trauma, all of that sort of thing. That's something that we know. And so it makes sense that it would translate in other parts of what we put in our body. And I think one of the things that really strikes me with all of this, Kerry, is being able to, I guess, educate people on the fact that part of being human is that we have some discomfort at times with feelings and thoughts and that kind of thing, and that just because that is happening doesn't mean that we need to immediately inoculate that or get rid of
Right.
that, but
Right.
learning how to sit with that, learning how to move through that and all of that sort of thing. And so it's just really, I think, just
Yes.
really important for us to remember that and just
Yes.
working with people.
There are three things necessary for human development: fear, discomfort, failure.
Hmm.
And when you think about the fact that we are, and I saw this when I became a parent, and it certainly feels like it's gotten worse today, where parents really struggle when their children are struggling, right? And want to rush in and solve it and fix them and almost like insulate them and wrap them in a bubble and stick them in the corner, right? And
Hmm.
that's the absolute worst thing you can do. I mean, they're not developing things like compassion, resiliency, right?
Hmm.
And so then they are really struggling. But the only way we're going to sort of develop that backbone is through practice.
Hmm.
My kids will tell you I was the parent that sometimes would intentionally terrify my children when they got much older, just to give them, and I always thought when they failed, when they did something stupid when they were younger, right? I didn't rush in to solve it. I just said, okay, what do you think you're going to do about that?
Hmm.
That sounds like an interesting decision you made, right?
Hmm.
That sounds
Hmm.
like it could. What could have gone bad, right? Like you kind of got out, you skirted that, but what could have gone wrong? And
Hmm.
so I really do think that there really is a need for parents to become a lot more involved in the practice of parenting and to not stick screens in front of their children's faces if they're bored at the restaurant.
Hmm.
Let
Hmm.
them be bored. You
Yeah.
know, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
boredom is what caused us to be creative, right? To build forts
Hmm.
out in the woods and to be doing things that really expanded our minds. And then also, working with groups of kids, right? Like you learn the spirit of cooperation and play. And those things are so important. And so seeing, kids being really kept in the house and stuck in front of the screens and listening to the teachers, I've seen some videos recently of teachers talking about that have been in the profession for many years and talking about how much the kids are changing and how they're becoming so dependent and addicted to these devices that when they come
Hmm.
into the classroom and they're removed from their possession, they literally melt down.
Hmm.
And I've seen some videos of this with kids, just they can't even manage being without their devices.
Hmm.
And it's just heartbreaking. I mean, I really,
Yeah.
really worry about the direction of the world, really, and in particular, with this younger generation not learning how to build emotional resiliency, how to just
Hmm.
sit with, and I hear this with adults too. So many of my adult clients, like, I feel anxious. What can I do? Make this go away. I'm like,
Hmm.
okay, so you feel anxious. Can
Yeah.
you just sit with it? Can you just make
Hmm.
space for it? I mean, this
Yeah.
is a part of the human journey. We're meant to feel all the things, right? And it
Right.
just feels like we've become, you know, like so fearful. We're afraid of fear, right? We're afraid of pain. They register as uncomfortable, and we're so accustomed to like the immediate fix.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah.
so many of the clients that I work with, they're just like, you just want me to sit with it? Yeah. Yeah, I do. I want you to sit with it. I want you to talk to it. I want you to swim around in it and see what it's here to teach you, right? See how you grow and develop from these feelings that are so uncomfortable and yes, inconvenient, but they make sense. I've had clients who are in my office, they've lost their spouse of 40 years, right? And it's like 6 months later, and they're just like, but I feel grief, and this feels so uncomfortable, and I can't do this, and I can't do that, and my family's becoming impatient with me. And I look at them and I say, well, but can you imagine not feeling that? I mean, what would it say if you didn't feel grief, right? And so I think we've become so impatient with just the experience of being human. And it's breaking my heart to see the degree to which we're pathologizing this and the degree to which people are being led to believe that every time they have a feeling or every time they maybe are overwhelmed and can't focus, oh, it's their ADHD. It's their, it's their depression or their anxiety. Maybe it's just the fact that you're human.
Yes.
Maybe, we're not meant to be perpetually happy all the time. I remember the first self-help book I ever saw, and I don't know how old I was. I was really young, and it was on the bookshelf at my house. My dad had it. It was called The Road Less Traveled.
Yes.
And the very first line in that book, I will never forget. And it was 3 words. Life is hard. Life is hard.
Yes.
And I think it's supposed to be.
Right.
I don't think we're here to have, like an easy experience. I think we're here to grow and to evolve. And I don't think those things happen when life is easy.
Right. Right. A thought occurred to me, and I know we've got to be mindful of our time, Kerry, but nothing stays in motion without stress.
Right.
And so, so you've got to have that in order to, the only way we learn anything new, like you said earlier, is through failure and through trying stuff and going beyond our comfort zone or putting ourselves in an uncomfortable place. An example I like to use with clients is do you remember when you learned to ride a bicycle and how scary that felt? And at the same time, exciting and all of that. But if you hadn't pushed past that fear or sat with that fear, you never would have learned to ride a bicycle.
Yeah.
And so,
that's really heartbreaking, right? To see how much people hold themselves back out of fear, right? Fear of what? Most of them don't even really know, right? But they're not really living. They're just sort of existing, and they're not really going out and grabbing life by the big kahunas, right? And having, a real joyful experience while they're here, or just an interesting, rich experience,
Right.
And that's heartbreaking.
Well,
there's one of my favorite poems called The Grasshopper by a poet, Mary Oliver. And the last line of that poem, she asks, tell me, what do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I don't think we were meant to just sit on the couch and watch TV and not go out and truly live. And yet it takes courage, right?
Right. Yeah, it truly does. Truly does. Well, Kerry, we could spend all day, and we might do that sometime, just talking about all of these things. But tell folks how they can get in touch with you and connect with you if they would like to. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so my website is divinelydriven.net. I've just started writing articles that I've been putting on Substack. I think it's at Kerry Thomas. I will be producing a podcast here soon called The Grace of Being Podcast, which will be happening very, very soon. So,
yes. And I'm excited to be with Kerry, on this journey, and I'm just so glad that we connected after all these years. Yes. So we'll have links in the show notes and the show summary so people can get to that easily. And Kerry, thanks for joining me on the podcast for this first time. Well, again, I'm really grateful to Kerry for joining me on the podcast. It sure was nice to connect with her, especially finding out how close we grew up together and just talking and reminiscing about the town of Cary, North Carolina when we were growing up. But anyway, check out Kerry's things, and hopefully this episode is giving you some food for thought and thinking about nutrition and how we think about medicines and just mental health in general, and just about how we can approach it in our practices, and really questioning some of the traditional ways of thinking of things. But anyway, there will be links here in the show notes and the show summary, as already mentioned. Also, big thanks to our sponsor of the podcast, TherapyNotes. They are the leading electronic health record system for mental health providers. They're who I use in my practice, and I'm constantly impressed with all the improvements they're putting into place. One of the things that they have now is the ability to create notes using artificial intelligence, and it's just a total game changer in being able to create notes quickly and efficiently using that platform. So be sure and check them out, practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes, and be sure and use the promo code just Gordon, Gordon, to try them out for 2 months for free. But yeah, big thanks to TherapyNotes. And also be sure and check out Chris McDonald's courses on integrating yoga in your practice. And you can find out more about that by going to practiceoftherapy.com/yoga and find the landing pages for that. So take care, folks. Do take time to follow us or subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it. And we'll be back with you again next week with another episode of the Practice of Therapy podcast. You've been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts. You can find out more about the other great podcasts in the network by visiting psychcraftnetwork.com. And if you haven't done so already, please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com and get your free private practice startup guide, along with a lot of other great resources and webinars and free things just by visiting. Also, be sure to follow us wherever you might be listening to your podcasts. This podcast is intended to be educational in purpose and is not intended to give legal, accounting, or counseling advice. If you need a professional, find the right person for that.